So welcome. Last week, for those of you that were here, Jean introduced the series we're doing on the three poisons. The first of those I'll be talking about tonight, which is greed, and then the second is hatred or aversion, and Teresa Miller is going to speak about that next week, and then the week after, Susan Stone will speak about delusion or ignorance, and then I think Jean's going to wrap up. No? Okay. Then we'll be done. So, greed. So suffice it to say, we all seek freedom, safety, happiness, joy. It's part of why we practice. It's part of why we come here. But the problem is we're looking in the wrong place. Our culture teaches us that it's the fulfillment of desires that's where we're going to find happiness and peace in our lives. The problem is that fulfilling desires is a fleeting and impermanent situation. So while we may temporarily feel happiness or joy from fulfilling our desires, it's not lasting, and therein lies the suffering. So if you recall from the Buddha's teaching, the second noble truth, the source of suffering is clinging, grasping, desire. It's been translated in a number of ways. Excuse me. The second noble truth, as I said. So it's very fundamental to the Buddha's teachings. And the craving for sense pleasures, sight, sound, smell, taste, bodily sensations, and the Buddha added a sixth, positive mental states, is ultimately what causes the suffering because of the fleeting nature, the temporary nature of the pleasure that we obtain from indulging those sense pleasures. Not to say we shouldn't do it, but when we grasp after them, when we cling to them, that is what produces the suffering. Any of those sense pleasures activate the pleasure centers of the brain. They cause a release of dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter. But at the extreme, they can become obsessive. They can become all-consuming. We've seen this in addictions to food, to sex, to alcohol, to drugs, power, success, money. The list goes on in terms of the things that we can become so obsessed with or preoccupied with that we just spend our life in pursuit of that pleasure. And the antidote, something we talk about here all the time, is, not surprisingly, the antidote is letting go. Just learning to let go of the clinging and the grasping, not of the sense pleasures themselves, but of our clinging and grasping to those sense pleasures. In the one of the suttas, the Maya Kakanana Sutta, the Buddha says, and I quote, "Not reviving the past, not hoping to be in the future. Instead, with insight, see each arising state, not craving after past experience, not setting one's heart on the future ones, not bound up in desire and craving." So how do we identify greed when it overtakes us? How do we identify greed when it arises? Well, probably the most direct way is by the discomfort that it creates within us. It may take the form of an agitated mind. We just feel agitated. We just feel that buzzing, that craving. It may be a longing, a seeking, a grasping. And it usually manifests in the heart-mind. Remember, the Buddha talked about the heart and mind as one entity. The idea being that what goes on in the mind and the heart are really inseparable in terms of feelings and thoughts. Interestingly, neuroscience is now finding out that there's very little separation there between thoughts and feelings. And so once again, something that the Buddha talked about 2,600 years ago as being borne out by modern neuroscience. But anyway, this discomfort that the craving and the longing and the seeking creates in us, it's a normal part of human experience. I mean, there's no reason why we should feel ashamed or bad about it. Again, because it's perfectly normal. The issue is, can we wake up to the suffering that is caused by our greediness, our grasping, our clinging? Can we identify those causes and conditions within each of us that results in this particular predisposition? If you think about it, this whole phenomenon occurs on a continuum from the most subtle to the most obvious. The most obvious being where I'm just stuffing my face with food or just drinking to excess or whatever. But it can also be very, very subtle. Just that, if you think about that, just that slight pulse that we might feel when we want that second piece of chocolate cake. It's just a very subtle little buzz that I'm going to talk about again in a minute of wanting that other dessert or that other thing, whatever it might be. And what we try to do with our practice is create countermeasures to this greed and clinging and grasping. The non-afflictive states, compassion, generosity, patience, spaciousness, kindness, and so forth and so on. All the things we talk about here every week. Now, I'm not suggesting that we walk around with a hair shirt and live an ascetic lifestyle. Again, I'm not saying that. I'm not suggesting that that's the solution. But what I am suggesting is that we work on the extent to which we cling to these sense pleasures. We grasp after them. We hold on to them tightly. We crave after them because that's where the suffering originates. I love this metaphor of the sense pleasures being like a clear lake, a beautiful clear lake filled with beautiful colored dyes. And it's very attractive, we're drawn to it, but the problem is we can't see clearly because the dye obscures our view of the beautiful clear lake and prevents us from seeing clearly. So we need to recognize the presence of these sensual desires and learn to manage them, learn how not to cling to them, to experience them, to enjoy them, but then to let go. Letting go being the key. And the task there is to become intimate with how it manifests in the body. So where do we feel it in the body? Where does it come up? Does it come up in terms of my mind becoming agitated? Does it come up in terms of bodily sensations? Different feelings and sensations that might arise when I'm craving or grasping after something. So the fundamental assumption of sense desires is that I have to have X, whatever X might be, to feel good or feel better. And we mistake that for getting rid of suffering, for getting rid of agitation, that temporarily there is a calming and a soothing benefit from indulging these sense pleasures. They feel good. But then the agitation returns. The dopamine gets released, then it depletes, and then all of a sudden we're back where we started. And the cycle repeats itself. I've been dealing with this issue of snacking. I'm retired, so I'm home a lot. And every little while I'd be working or reading, and I'd get up and go to the kitchen and get something sweet or salty. And I realized, in response to that, I undertook a 3-day juice fast where I just had juice every 4 to 6 hours, 8 ounces of juice over a 3-day period, which was really an interesting undertaking because I became aware that I didn't snack because I was hungry. I snacked because I was bored or I was tired or I was just wanted to feel better, just wanted something that made me feel good. And I craved that sense pleasure of eating something really tasty. It didn't matter that I wasn't hungry. It had nothing to do with hunger. It had everything to do with just feeling good and getting rid of that negative emotional state, whatever it might have been, boredom, fatigue, loneliness, whatever. And it was so instructive with regard to my relationship with food and this whole idea of greed and craving. Because what I realized was that I have this constant buzzing in the background. Sometimes it's very subtle, sometimes it's louder, which tells me, go get something to eat, go get a snack. And it was really instructive with regard to my relationship to food and my relationship to fulfilling that particular sense desire, something I think all of us, many of us rather, struggle with. And not having food really made that so clear to me because that buzzing became a scream, like, go get a snack, because I wasn't eating. So it was a real insight for me in terms of how this whole thing operates at a real obvious level. I would just say, as an aside, just parenthetically, that it also really demonstrated to me how fortunate most of us are to have an abundance of food. I mean, the fact that there are people that experience hunger involuntarily every day is something that it really made me appreciate just over that brief period of time, because it wasn't much fun. An empty stomach is not a lot of fun, and yet there are many people that go to bed with that every night, including many children. So the task then is learning to guard our sense doors. You probably heard that expression, guarding the sense doors, by knowing the triggers, in this case, boredom, loneliness, fatigue with my fast, and trying to avoid those triggers as best we can or find alternative ways of dealing with those triggers than just indulging just by grasping and clinging after a sense pleasure. Because otherwise we really become prisoners of our own senses and our own sense pleasures. And the task is, can we begin to see renunciation not as deprivation or not as punishment, but just as another form of letting go? Joseph Goldstein calls renunciation non-addiction. Just the idea that, all the world's religions talk about forms of renunciation as a part of a spiritual practice. And I really think it cuts through all of those traditions because the importance of letting go and not being prisoner to our sense pleasures, which I think is instrumental to is just central to any spiritual path, and certainly including our own. But it means giving up the illusion that more stuff or other forms of sense pleasures will provide us with lasting happiness or joy. It may provide us with momentarily happiness or joy, but it's not going to provide us with lasting happiness or joy. One of the ironies here is that the more choices we have, the less happy we are. You may recall a book that was published in 2004 by a psychologist named Barry Schwartz called The Paradox of Choice. And he talks about how having all these choices in our culture leads to feelings of anxiety, loneliness, and depression, because instead of increasing our capacity to make a decision, it really just overwhelms us and cripples us. And so it's not like more is better or having more choices necessarily leads to more happiness either. So what happens is we become identified with these cravings and longings, which is one reason we begin to suffer. So for instance, I see the new iPhone and say, oh boy, I really like to have that new iPhone. And then the next stage is, I must have that new iPhone. I really must have it. It's just critical that I have that new iPhone. So I go get the new iPhone. And temporarily, I'm really excited and I'm having such a good time. I'm downloading all these apps. But pretty soon the novelty wears off. It's just another phone. And I'm on to the next new shiny thing. Or I'm just sad and suffering because my phone is not bringing me the joy that it brought me initially. If you think for a moment about how much of our social interactions are about stuff, it occurred to me as I was putting the talk together, so, oh, is that a new dress, a new coat, new shoes, new hairdo, new car, new watch, new iPhone, new TV, new whatever. I mean, we're just consumed with this stuff. We live in this consumer culture and we're just consumed with the fact that the culture reminds us constantly that more is better. From an evolutionary perspective, we have these appetites which are critical to survival. We have all these appetitive drives. The problem is they don't have an on-off switch. So once we activate them, like with food, our ancestors had, when there was food there, they better really eat, or they're going to not know when their next meal is coming from. Well, we have the residue of that from an evolutionary perspective, and yet it doesn't serve us well. And that's true with so many of these appetites that we evolved for purposes of survival. We don't live those of us in this community that are here tonight don't live with much scarcity. We live with abundance. And the problem is you've got strong appetites and abundance, and those two things can really create difficulty in terms of overindulging the sense pleasures. Philip Moffat says that our appetites create a stickiness to our experience, not unlike that which I described when I was talking about food and fasting. In the Abhidhamma, which is the Buddha's teachings on psychology, he says that the proximate cause of our unhappiness is seeing enjoyment in things that put us in bondage. The proximate cause of our unhappiness is seeing enjoyment in things that put us in bondage. And there he's talking about the sense pleasures and anything after which we cling or grasp. You may know the story of the monkey trap. The farmer creates a basket with an opening in it, and it's large enough for the monkey to get his hand in. But he puts a banana in the bottom of it, and you can't remove your hand. The monkey can't remove his hand as long as he's clinging to the banana. So he's stuck. He won't let go. He won't release. He's clinging. He's grasping to the banana. And the farmer catches him. So he's now in bondage, or he's tonight's dinner, depending on the cultural setting. And there we are. I mean, it's the perfect metaphor. If we let go, drop the banana, we can release and have some freedom. If we don't, if we cling to the banana, we're trapped and we suffer. Each of us we all have differing patterns to this phenomenon of greed. And our task is, through our practice, is to learn to identify our pattern. Where are we vulnerable to becoming captive to our desires? And again, I would suggest that the way to start is by going into the body, looking at our bodily responses, including our mental responses, the agitation in the mind. But just take a moment and think of a recurring craving that you experience. It might be chocolate, it might be ice cream, certain objects, it might be attention from others, it might be money, it might be a new car. But just bring an object to mind that you crave or have craved before, and see if you can feel where that comes up in the body. What thoughts arise. What form does the craving take? Can you feel that pull? Now just imagine relaxing and letting it go, feeling the release. Just sort of feel the freedom that comes to the body, just the letting go, the relaxation. That's a useful exercise in working with greed and craving and attachment. Because as happened with my fast, it'll give you some insight into where you get tripped up on this issue. Now, as I said, greed, craving, longing, all of these things are normal parts of the human experience. The problem becomes when we become identified with that greed. I must have it. In order to be happy, I need to have that. Not that I'd like to have it or it would be nice to have it, I must have it. My happiness depends on it. Therein lies the problem. Ajahn Sumedho, the Theravada monk, says that we can fill our desires, and we must fulfill our desires to survive without identifying with them. Without identifying with them. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pass it back to Liz, who's going to lead us in a contemplation that she has put together. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes for comments or questions at the end. But thank you, and here's Liz.
So I really appreciated how Jeff brought up the ideas of abundance and scarcity. So for this contemplation, we'll be considering how abundance and scarcity feel in our own bodies. So I'll invite us all to turn our gaze inward towards our minds, this body in this moment. And we might start out with a gentle inquiry. What has our engagement with the subject of greed? What kinds of stories have come up in the mind? How is the body reacting to the idea of our own greed? The mind might be eager to look for right and wrong, for good and bad. And as Jeff said, turning our attention towards the body may help to tether us to this moment. We might find the breath in the body. We might ask for a sense of spaciousness in the torso. Perhaps coming into an awareness of the support of the ground through our chairs, our cushions. And I'll invite us all to bring to mind a time in life where we felt embraced, cared for, and nurtured. may have seemed that there were plentiful resources available to us, a sense of generosity from others. A circumstance could be tied to family, friends, material well-being, the beauty of the natural world. Could be a sense of spiritual unity or deeply felt health. Could also be as simple as curling up on the couch with a loved one or a pet, watching a good movie on a rainy night. And also taking a moment to acknowledge that for some of us, the sense of abundance is not as accessible, in which case we can use the mind's creative capacity to imagine a situation that offers us nurturance, security, and deep contentment. And as we allow the mind this memory, taking note of the felt sense of the body, there may be some expansion in the torso, a feeling of ease, connectedness. And taking some moments here to feel the breath moving through the body and merging with this felt sense of having enough and being enough. And now we may bring to mind an area, perhaps an interaction in our lives, in which the idea of scarcity may play a role for us personally, the idea of greed. This could be a habitual relationship with food, as Jeff mentioned, our attitude, relationship with money, consuming or purchasing anything from clothing, books, household items. There could also be intangible instances of greed. desiring attention, power, space, or dominance at others' expense. And societally, there may be an awareness of the advantage in terms of political and economic power that those of us with white skin may hold. An awareness of the finite resources on this planet, our personal consumption of these resources on a daily basis. And even as I list some of these possible avenues of greed or scarcity, what is the experience of this body with even just the mention of our desires not being met, our needs not being met, of not having enough, ourselves not being enough? It may be quite difficult to stay with the body if the body feels a sense of contraction or gripping, dis-ease. There may be a sense that the breath is not as easy in the body. Turning our attention towards whatever felt sense, whatever emotion might be present, and to the best of our capacities, offering it some space, some room, some acknowledgement. Perhaps there are stories emerging in the mind. Again, allowing those some gentleness, some allowance. And I'll close this contemplation with some affirmations of loving kindness. Helping us to find some balance between these energies. Some care and compassion towards ourselves. May we recognize the abundance of life that surrounds us. May we feel more genuinely supported and nurtured in our lives. May we have the strength and courage to share kindness with ourselves in moments of fear, scarcity, and greed. May we offer compassion to those around us who also fall prey to fear and to greed. And may we grow more skillful in understanding the interconnection of our lives to all lives, of our lives to all beings.